You think you know Viking brutality? Monasteries burned, treasures stolen, monks slaughtered on altars, but there's a darker corner nobody talks about: the women. The consecrated virgins locked behind monastery walls when dragon ships appeared on the horizon. What they did to themselves to escape what was coming is worse than anything the Vikings could inflict. Razors, blood, faces carved beyond recognition. And it worked. Sort of. The year is 870. Scottish coast, Coldingham Monastery sits on cliffs above the North Sea. Inside, Abbess Ebba the Younger knows what's coming. Word travels fast in these lands. Two Viking warlords, Ivar called the Boneless and his brother Ubba, are tearing through Northumbria with thousands of men. The Great Heathen Army. That's what chronicles call it. Not raiders, conquerors. They've already broken East Anglia. King Edmund died tied to a tree, shot full of arrows for refusing to renounce Christ. The Danes massacred his people, burned his monasteries, took survivors in chains. If you value documented medieval history and Viking-era accounts like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Matthew Paris's Chronica Majora, written in the 1240s at St. Albans Abbey, and published in the Rolls series, as well as contemporary annals, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Annals of Ulster, which provide day-level accounts of Viking movements. We're also drawing from modern archaeological analysis published in peer-reviewed journals, including the 2022 study in the Journal of Medieval History on Viking captive-taking practices, and Jane Schulenberg's scholarship on early medieval women's communities published by Cambridge University Press. These aren't generalized history books. These are primary sources and specialized academic research that reconstruct what actually happened. Now, back to Coldingham. Ebba's monastery houses dozens of nuns, Benedictines following the rule. They've heard the stories. Danish Vikings don't just kill monks, they take the young ones, women especially. The Annals of Ulster record it plain, 821 near Dublin. A great booty of women carried into captivity. Chronicles from across Europe repeat the pattern. Convents and monasteries attacked, nuns abducted, some ransomed if their families have silver. Most disappear into slave markets. Dublin, Hedeby, Burka. Human chattel sold alongside furs and amber. Ebba is royal blood, daughter of the King of Northumbria. She knows what waits. Vikings of this era practice polygyny, multiple wives, multiple concubines. Scholars estimate slaves comprised 25% of Scandinavian populations during this period. Genetic evidence from Iceland tells the story. 2/3 of Iceland's female founding population shows Gaelic ancestry, Irish and Scottish. 1/3 male population shows Nordic ancestry. Do the math. Viking men in Iceland had children with women taken from the British Isles in raids, not wives, captives. The Danish fleet is days away, maybe hours. Ebba calls her nuns to the chapter house. Stone walls, candles flickering, fear you can taste. She tells them the truth. The barbarians are coming. They will breach these walls. They will do what raiders do to consecrated virgins. But there's a way out. One path to preserve their chastity, even if they can't preserve their lives. She lifts a razor, the kind used for tonsure, shaving monks at heads. She places the blade against her upper lip, and she cuts, nose first. The cartilage crunches, blood pours, then the upper lip. She saws through flesh and muscle until the lip falls away. Her face transforms into something inhuman, something repulsive. 40 nuns watch. Then they reach for razors, one by one. Nose after nose, lip after lip. The chapter house becomes an abattoir. Blood pools on stone floors. Women cry out to Christ. Some pass out from pain. Others finish the work half-conscious. By morning, the entire community looks like something from a nightmare. Mutilated, disfigured, unrecognizable. The Vikings arrive at dawn. Ivar and Ubba lead the way. They've done this 100 times. Smash the gates. Round up the clergy. Separate the treasures from the bodies. But when they burst into Coldingham, they stop. The nuns stand there, faces destroyed, blood-crusted, eyes hollow. The 13th century chronicle, Matthew Paris, writing in the 1240s, drawing from earlier accounts, says the Vikings fled in horror. These hardened warriors who've waded through battlefields soaked in blood and guts. These men who've burned children alive and thrown priests into rivers. They see these mutilated women and they run. But Vikings don't forgive humiliation. They return before midday. They don't rape the nuns. They don't enslave them. They lock every door. They pile wood against the walls. They set Coldingham ablaze. Ebba and her 40 nuns burn alive inside the chapter house where they mutilated themselves. The chronicler records it as martyrdom. The glory of martyrdom, he writes, as if that makes it better. As if dying in flames somehow justifies what they did to their own faces. Coldingham, 870. That's the famous case, but it's not the first. Turn back the clock, 783. Monastery of Saint Cyr near Marseille. Southern France, Abbess Eusebia, 40 nuns. Different enemy, Saracens this time, not Vikings, but same script. Raiders approaching, women trapped. Eusebia gathers her community. She tells them about chastity, about sacrifice, about how their virginity matters more than their lives. She cuts off her nose, the nuns follow, all 40 of them. When the Saracens break in, they find 40 women with mutilated faces praying to Christ. The raiders massacre every one of them. The attackers don't retreat in horror. They just kill them and move on. 838. Saint Eusebia's feast day is September 20th. Her tomb sits in the church of Saint-Victor in Marseille. You can visit it today. Now jump forward. Medieval Spain. Exact date unclear, somewhere in the 9th or 10th century. Monastery of Saint Florentine near Écija. 300 nuns. 300. The largest case on record. Moorish invasion sweeping north. Muslim armies pushing into Christian territories. These nuns hear what's coming. They gather in the church. The abbess speaks. Mass self-mutilation begins. 300 women slashing their own faces. The historical record here gets fuzzy. Matthew Paris mentions it in his chronicles written centuries later. Modern scholars debate how much of this is real versus legendary, but the story spreads. 300 virgins choosing disfigurement over defilement. When the Moors arrive, they slaughter every one of them anyway. Swords through 300 mutilated nuns, blood running down church aisles, bodies piled where they prayed. 3 cases, 3 monasteries, 3 continents worth of distance from Scotland to France to Spain, but the same pattern. Abbesses leading their communities in ritualized self-harm, razors against flesh, noses and lips severed, all to make themselves unrapeable, all ending in death anyway. The question that tears through history: did this actually happen? Or are these medieval fairy tales designed to teach lessons about female chastity? Scholars split down the middle. On one side, these stories appear in contemporary or near-contemporary sources. The annals and chronicles mention specific dates, specific people, specific places. Coldingham existed. Ebba was real. Archaeology confirms the monastery. St. Cyr existed. Eusebia's tomb is real. The timeline matches documented Viking and Saracen raids. On the other side, all 3 stories follow suspiciously similar patterns. Virtuous abbess. Entire community following her lead. Raiders repulsed by mutilation. Martyrdom in flames or by sword. It reads like hagiography. Saints. Lives designed for moral instruction, not historical accuracy. And crucially, these stories don't appear in the absolute earliest sources. They show up in chronicles written decades or centuries after the alleged events. Matthew Paris wrote his Chronica Majora in the 1230s and 1240s. That's 3.5 centuries after Coldingham. He's relying on earlier sources, sure. But how many layers of copying and embellishment sit between the event and his account? Medieval chroniclers didn't operate like modern historians. They included legends alongside facts. They shaped narratives for theological purposes. A story about nuns choosing mutilation over rape serves multiple functions. It reinforces the supreme importance of virginity in medieval Christianity. It portrays female martyrs as active agents in their own salvation, not passive victims. It provides a gruesome but memorable lesson for future nuns facing similar threats. But here's what makes the story stick: the details. Real details that don't feel invented. The specific razor for tonsure, the chapter house gathering, the noses and lips, not random mutilation, but targeted disfigurement designed to destroy sexual attractiveness while leaving the nuns mobile and conscious. If you're making this up, why those specifics? Why not something more dramatic or holy? Why razors instead of divine intervention? Why mutilation instead of miraculous rescue? And the details match what we know about Viking behavior. The Annals of Ulster, Annals of Fulda. Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, contemporary sources written by people living through these events, record systematic targeting of women and children by Viking raiders. Not random, strategic. The 2022 study by Ben Raffield, published in the Journal of the History of Childhood and Youth, analyzes slave-taking patterns. Vikings specifically targeted women for their economic value, not just for sex, for textile production, for skilled labor, for breeding. Women were worth more than male slaves in many markets. A healthy young woman with craft skills could fetch prices equivalent to multiple male laborers. Vikings didn't raid for fun, they raided for profit. Human trafficking was the business model. Dublin becomes a major slave market by the mid-900s. Archaeological evidence, iron collars, manacles, shackle fragments, found in Viking-era layers throughout Ireland and Britain. Some initially misidentified as livestock restraints. Then researchers measured the dimensions. Human-sized, Chester, York, Lincoln. English cities under Viking control show similar finds. The documentary evidence matches. Chronicle after chronicle mentions captives, carried off in chains, taken for slavery, sold to the heathens. Numbers pile up. The annals mention 3,000 people captured in a single raid in 912. 3,000? If even half that's accurate, we're talking industrial-scale human trafficking. So when Ebba hears the Danes are coming, she's not overreacting, she's calculating. She knows what Vikings do with consecrated virgins. She knows the alternative to death. Slavery in Hedeby or Dublin, concubinage to some Danish warlord, textile labor in some Scandinavian longhouse. For a royal princess who became an abbess, who spent her life in prayer and contemplation, that fate is genuinely worse than death. For her, the choice is rational. Mutilate now, die clean, achieve martyrdom, or stay beautiful, get captured. Lose everything that makes life meaningful. The psychology makes sense too. Medieval Christian culture placed virginity on a pedestal, literally. Virgin martyrs like St. Lucy, St. Agnes, St. Agatha, they dominate hagiography. Their virginity matters more than their lives. Ebba grew up on these stories. So did her nuns. When she proposes self-mutilation, she's not inventing a new concept. She's applying existing theology to an immediate crisis. If St. Lucy could tear out her own eyes rather than marry a pagan, why can't Ebba cut off her nose rather than be raped by one? The follow-through is what's remarkable. 40 women actually doing it. Not one or two zealots, the entire community. That requires either absolute faith, absolute terror, or both. Imagine being in that chapter house. You're 20 years old. You took vows 3 years ago. You've never left monastery grounds. Your entire world is these walls, these women, these prayers. Now the abbess, this royal, respected, holy woman, slices off her own face and tells you to do the same. What do? Refuse and face certain rape? Comply and face certain death? There's no good option. So you reach for the razor, because at least this way you control something. You choose your disfigurement rather than enduring theirs. Some scholars argue the story is too perfect, too theologically neat. Raiders arriving, nuns mutilating, Vikings fleeing, monastery burning. It hits every beat of a morality play. And the fact that similar stories appear in France and Spain suggests a traveling legend rather than independent events. But here's the counterpoint. Certain situations produce certain responses. If you trap consecrated virgins in a monastery with raiders approaching, they have limited options: hide, flee, fight, submit, or destroy what the raiders want. Different communities at different times facing similar threats might independently choose similar solutions. The St. Cyr story in 783 predates Coldingham by nearly 90 years. That's plenty of time for word to spread. Medieval Europe had communication networks. Monks and nuns traveled. Letters circulated. Stories traveled faster than you'd think. If Eusebia's mutilation strategy worked even partially, other abbesses might try it. The Spanish case with 300 nuns. That's where credibility breaks. 300 is a suspiciously round number. Medieval chroniclers loved symbolic numbers. 300 echoes the 300 Spartans. It suggests legend more than fact. But strip away the 300. Assume it's 50 nuns or 60 or 80. Still significant. Still mass self-mutilation. Still documented in sources. The core story might be real, even if the details inflate over time. What's certain is this. Medieval women in convents faced real threats. Viking raids weren't theoretical. The Danish conquest of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia between 865 and 874 is documented fact. The great heathen army existed. Ivar and Ubba existed. They really did conquer most of England. They really did target monasteries and churches. Contemporary sources, not later chronicles, but actual 9th century documents record the devastation. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle entry for 870. This year, the army rode over Mercia into East Anglia, and there fixed their winter quarters at Thetford. And in the winter, King Edmund fought with them, but the Danes gained the victory and slew the king, whereupon they overran all that land and destroyed all the monasteries to which they came. Destroyed all the monasteries, not some, all. What does destroyed mean? Archaeological evidence shows burning, structural collapse, hasty burials. At Lindisfarne in 793, the first major Viking raid in England, the monastery was trampled, according to Alcuin's letter written that same year. The church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God. Stripped of all its furnishings, exposed to the plundering of pagans, monks killed, treasures stolen, 793. That's 77 years before Coldingham. So by 870, everyone knows what Vikings do. Every monastery from Scotland to Kent knows the pattern. Except now, it's not hit-and-run raids, it's conquest. The great heathen army overwinters in England, builds fortifications, establishes control. This isn't looting, it's occupation. And occupied territories need labor, need tribute, need women. The deliberate targeting of women appears across the sources. The annals of Fulda record Danish Vikings carrying off captives, especially women and children, in the 850s. The Life of Findon, a 9th century hagiography, describes an Irish noblewoman taken captive and ransomed by Vikings. The 1140s account from Ibn Hawqal describes Viking slave traders selling women across the Mediterranean. The economics explain it. A Viking raid requires investment, building ships, gathering crews, sailing to hostile territory. The prophet has to justify the risk. Gold and silver are great, but they're finite. You loot a monastery once, the treasure's gone. Humans are renewable resources. You can capture them, transport them, sell them, and those profits fund the next raid. Slave trading becomes self-perpetuating. The more people you capture, the more ships you can build, the more raids you can launch, the more people you can capture. By the mid-900s, Dublin is one of Europe's major slave markets. Archaeological excavations on High Street and Slave Street in Dublin, yes, they literally called it Slave Street, reveal iron shackles, collars, and chains in Viking-era layers. Chemical analysis of metal composition matches Scandinavian production techniques. These weren't local Irish manufacturers. Vikings brought the restraints with them. They came prepared to take people. Skeletal evidence tells darker stories. Mass graves from the Viking Age show patterns of violence against women. A grave on the Isle of Man contains a wealthy Viking warrior buried with a young woman whose skull shows fatal trauma from a single blow to the top of her head. She was killed specifically for the burial. Her bones show no signs of illness or natural death, just sudden violence. She was property, disposed of to accompany her owner into the afterlife. Similar burials appear throughout Scandinavia and Viking-settled regions. Women killed as burial offerings, children included sometimes. The archaeological record is clear. Vikings valued human life in economic terms. You're worth what someone will pay for you. If you're worth more dead, as a burial good that enhances a warrior's funeral, than alive, you die. Against this backdrop, Ebba's choice looks less insane. She's not overreacting to theoretical danger. She's making a calculated decision based on documented patterns. Cut off your face or end up in a grave on some Danish farm. For her nuns, the theological framework makes the choice obvious. Virginity equals salvation. Rape equals damnation. Not literally in doctrine, but culturally in how rape victims were treated in medieval society. A raped nun couldn't just resume her role. She was polluted, damaged, unworthy of her vows. Better to be dead and pure than alive and defiled. So they chose mutilation, chose pain, chose disfigurement, and then chose death when the Vikings returned. But did the Vikings actually flee in horror? Matthew Paris says they did. The later versions of Florus Historiarum say they did. But the earliest reference we have to the Coldingham story is from the Chronicon of Simeon of Durham, written in the early 1200s. That's more than 3 centuries after the event. Simeon records the story but doesn't provide sourcing. Where did he get it? Oral tradition? Earlier written accounts now lost? We don't know. The gap raises questions. If this really happened in 870 Ars Domaris, why don't contemporary or near-contemporary sources mention it? The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle covers Viking movements in detail. It doesn't mention Coldingham. The Annals of Ulster track Irish Sea Vikings closely. No mention. The Historia Britannicum, the Chronicon Scotorum, other British and Irish chronicles, none reference Ebba the Younger or the mutilation. The silence is deafening. Either the story was local knowledge that didn't make it into wider chronicles until centuries later, or it's largely legendary. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Coldingham was a remote monastery on the Scottish coast. It wasn't a major political or religious center like Lindisfarne or Iona. A Viking attack there might not generate chronicle entries, especially if everyone died. Who survives to tell the story? The chronicle claims a man hid nearby and witnessed everything. Convenient, classic hagiographic device, the hidden witness who reports the martyrdom. It smells like narrative invention, yet archaeology confirms parts of the story. Excavations at Coldingham between 2017 and 2019 by Dig Ventures proved the monastery existed on that site in the 9th century. They found structural remains, Artifacts: evidence of fire damage consistent with Viking-era destruction. The monastery burned. When exactly? Carbon dating on charred timbers gives a range covering 850 to 900. So yes, fire. Yes, destruction. Yes, Viking-era timing. Does that prove Ebba's mutilation? No, but it proves the monastery existed and burned during the period when Vikings were active in the region. The story has a foundation in reality, but how much is embellished? Unknown. Similar patterns with St. Cyr. The monastery existed. The Saracen raids happened. 838 is precisely documented for Muslim attacks on southern France. The Arab chronicles, Ibn Hayyan and others, record a Viking raid on Mazima. Morocco in 859, where 2 women from the royal harem were taken captive and ransomed. If Saracens are taking women in Morocco, they're taking women in France. Eusebia's fear was rational. Whether she and 40 nuns actually mutilated themselves, the only source is her epitaph and later hagiographic accounts. No contemporary chronicle confirms it. But the Abbey of St. Victor was destroyed by Saracens in 838. That's documented. The circumstances exist for the story to be true. Whether it is true depends on how much you trust medieval hagiography. The Spanish case is even murkier. Saint Florentine, also called Florentina, was a real historical figure. Sister to Saint Leander of Seville, Saint Isidore of Seville, and Saint Fulgentius. All 4 siblings canonized. Florentina founded a monastery near Ecija in the late 6th century. She died around 612. That's more than 200 years before the alleged mutilation story. The monastery she founded may have continued under her name, but the story of 300 nuns mutilating themselves during a Moorish invasion? That appears only in late medieval sources. No contemporary Arab or Christian chronicles mention it. The numbers are too neat. 300 is symbolic. The story fits the pattern too perfectly. It looks like the Coldingham and St. Cyr stories were combined, amplified, and transplanted to Spain to provide a local martyrdom legend, but strip away the embellishments and a core truth remains. Medieval nuns faced real dangers. Viking raids, Saracen invasions, Magyar attacks. These weren't myths. They happened. Women in convents were targeted. Some were killed. Some were captured. Some disappeared into slave markets. The historical record is clear on that. Whether specific communities chose mutilation as a response? Possible. The psychology fits. The theology supports it. The circumstances demand extreme measures. Women with razors carving up their own faces to escape rape isn't crazier than men flagellating themselves to earn salvation. Medieval Christianity embraced suffering, pain as path to God, mutilation as martyrdom. It's theologically consistent, even if it's morally horrifying to modern eyes. 2 more cases strengthen the argument. Saint Margaret of Hungary, 13th century. She threatened to cut off her nose if her family forced her to marry. She wanted to become a nun. Marriage would destroy her vocation. So she made the same threat Ebba executed. Mutilation as defense of virginity. She didn't have to follow through. Her family relented. But the threat was real. Credible. Everyone believed she'd do it. Why? Because the precedent existed. Because stories of nuns mutilating themselves were already in circulation. Margaret knew the tactic because the history was known. Saint Margaret of Cortona, 13th century, same pattern. Threatened self-mutilation to preserve religious vocation. The threat worked. No actual cutting necessary. But the fact that multiple medieval women used this threat suggests it was a recognized strategy. A last resort, yes, but a known option. Ebba's mutilation becomes a pattern, a template. Other religious women know it's possible. Some threaten it, some execute it. The story spreads, gets embellished, gets repeated. By Matthew Paris's time in the 1300s, it's firmly embedded in hagiographic tradition. He treats it as established fact, includes it alongside other historical events. No skepticism, no questioning. For him and his contemporaries, the story is true because it should be true. It illustrates proper Christian virtue. Abbesses and nuns choosing disfigurement over dishonor. That's exemplary behavior, worth recording, worth spreading, worth teaching to every generation of consecrated virgins. The practical question is how? How do you mutilate your own face? The sources say razors, tonsure blades. These are sharp, used for shaving monks, heads, cutting through hair and scalp, but noses and lips are different. The nose is mostly cartilage. You can slice through cartilage with a sharp blade. It's painful, but doable. Cut from the bridge down to the nostrils. Sever the cartilage. The nose collapses. Lips are flesh and muscle. Cut horizontally across the upper lip. Sever the muscle. The lip falls away or hangs loose. Blood loss is significant, but not immediately fatal. The wounds would need cauterization or pressure to stop bleeding, but if you're planning to die anyway, blood loss doesn't matter. The goal isn't survival. The goal is making your face unrecognizable, undesirable, repulsive. The pain would be extraordinary. No anesthesia, no pain relief, just cold metal and hot agony. Some women would pass out, some would vomit from shock, some would die from blood loss or trauma. But if 40 women actually did this, or even half that number, it demonstrates commitment that's hard to fathom from our comfortable distance. These women believed absolutely in their theology. Virginity mattered more than pain. Heaven mattered more than earthly comfort. Death mattered less than defilement. You can call it brainwashing. You can call it patriarchal control over women's bodies. You can call it religious extremism. But from inside their worldview, it makes sense. They're making the only choice that preserves their identity and their salvation. When the Vikings see them, two things happen. First, shock. Even hardened warriors aren't expecting this. You raid a monastery expecting treasure and captives. You get blood-soaked, mutilated women praying in Latin. It's disturbing even for men who've seen battle. But shock turns to rage. The Vikings came for profit. These women destroyed their value. Can't sell a mutilated woman. Can't use her as a concubine. Can't even parade her as a trophy. She's worthless now. Worse than worthless. She's a loss. The raiders invested time and effort to get here. They expected return on investment. Instead, they get defiance. So they respond with violence, burn the monastery, kill everyone inside, erase the insult, move on to targets that actually yield profit. The burning is documented across Viking raids. Fire is cheap and effective. Wooden structures burn easily. Stone buildings get hot enough to crack. Everyone inside dies from smoke or heat. It's a massacre tool. Quick, efficient. Sends a message. After Coldingham burns, other monasteries know what happened. The story spreads. Whether it stops other Vikings, unknown. But it tells other abbesses they have options. Die fighting, die fleeing, die submitting. Or die on your own terms after making yourself unsellable. Some might choose Ebba's path, others might choose differently. But knowing the option exists changes the calculation. The legacy is complicated. On one hand, these stories celebrate female agency. Ebba and Eusebia don't wait passively for rescue. They don't pray for miracles. They act decisively, violently, against themselves, yes, but action nonetheless. They control the one thing they can control, their own bodies, even if that control means destruction. Medieval hagiography presents them as heroes, martyrs, saints, women who chose death over dishonor. That's powerful. It gives female religious figures active roles in their salvation narratives, not victims, victors. They defeated the Vikings not by fighting, but by removing the prize. On the other hand, it's horror. Women so trapped by circumstance and theology that mutilation looks rational. So indoctrinated into purity culture that razor blades feel like reasonable choices. So lacking in real options that self-destruction becomes self-defense. Modern readers see the tragedy, see the systematic oppression, see the violence men inflicted on women creating conditions where women inflict violence on themselves. The Vikings are villains. But the culture that tells women their worth lies only in their virginity. That's villainous, too. Ebba isn't heroic. She's desperate. Her nuns aren't martyrs. They're victims. Victims of Vikings. Victims of medieval Christianity. Victims of a world where women's bodies are battlegrounds for male power. Both readings are valid. The story works as inspiration and as warning, as triumph and as tragedy. Medieval audiences saw courage. We see coercion. They saw saints. We see survivors stuck in impossible situations, making terrible choices. The distance of 1,000 years gives perspective. But it also removes understanding. We can't fully grasp what it meant to be a consecrated virgin. In 870, how much of your identity was wrapped up in virginity, how completely your salvation depended on maintaining that state, how absolute your terror was when Vikings appeared. We have the luxury of judgment. They had the necessity of choice. The story doesn't end with Ebba. It echoes, repeats, morphs. By the late Middle Ages, it becomes a cautionary tale, a teaching tool. Novice nuns hear about Coldingham and St. Cyr. They learn what their forebears did. Whether they should emulate it becomes a theological debate. Some argue yes, mutilation preserves the greater good. Your face is temporary, your soul is eternal, better ugly in this life and beautiful in the next than the reverse. Others argue no, God gave you your body. Destroying it is sin. Trust in divine providence. If Vikings take you, that's God's will. Your virginity isn't your salvation. Christ is. Resistance isn't required. Acceptance is faith. The debate never resolves. Different regions, different orders, different answers. But the story persists. It's too vivid to forget, too extreme to ignore. It crystallizes everything about medieval female monasticism. The devotion, the danger, the desperation. It asks uncomfortable questions about faith and choice and coercion. It forces us to confront what people will do when caught between theological certainty and physical threat. And it reminds us that history isn't clean, isn't simple, isn't comfortable. Sometimes the heroes are broken, people making broken choices and broken systems. Sometimes the villains are cultures, not individuals. Sometimes there are no good options, only less terrible ones. 870. Coldingham burns. Ebba and her 40 nuns die in flames. Their mutilated faces turn to ash. The monastery collapses. Vikings move on. For centuries, the site lies abandoned. Wind off the North Sea. Waves crashing on cliffs. Nothing but ruins and ghosts. Then, in 1098, King Edgar of Scotland refounds the monastery. Benedictine monks from Durham, they build on the old site. Call it Coldingham Priory. It survives into the Reformation, gets destroyed again, rebuilt again. Today, it's a parish church. Visitors walk where Ebba walked, stand where the chapter house stood. The church preserves some medieval stonework, fragments of the priory walls, but nothing from Ebba's time, nothing from 870. The fire was too complete. 2 miles away on the coast, Kirkhill rises above the sea. That's where the original 7th century monastery stood. Ebba the Elder's foundation. Before the fire, before the Vikings, archaeologists excavated there, found post holes, ditches, artifacts, evidence of early medieval occupation, and evidence of fire, burning in the 9th century. Whether that's Ebba the Younger's monastery or separate destruction, unclear. The dating overlaps. The location is close, but not exact. The archaeology confirms Viking-era violence. Whether it confirms the mutilation story? No. Physical evidence of facial mutilation wouldn't survive. Bones show cut marks sometimes, but razor cuts to cartilage and soft tissue leave no trace on skeletons. The nuns burned anyway. Any evidence turned to ash. What survives is the story. Matthew Paris writes it. Others copy it. It spreads through medieval Europe, appears in chronicles, in saints, lives, in moral instruction. It becomes part of the cultural memory. Whether true or legendary matters less than its impact. Women hear the story and know their choices. Men hear it and understand the stakes. Everyone learns that consecrated virginity is worth dying for, worth mutilating for, worth burning for. The story does work, shapes behavior, influences decisions. That's why it persists. In 2024, academic debate continues. Did Ebba really cut off her nose? Probably not with the specific details the chronicles provide. But did Viking raids target women? Absolutely. Did some women resist in extreme ways? Likely. Did monasteries burn with women inside? Certainly. The core elements are real. The embellishments are questionable. The lesson is clear. Women caught between predators and theology make desperate choices. Sometimes those choices look insane from outside. From inside, they're the only rational response. Ebba looked at her options, chose the one that preserved her identity, executed it completely, and died holding her beliefs intact. You can admire that. You can mourn it. You can rage against the systems that forced that choice. All three responses are valid. The Vikings didn't win at Coldingham. They got treasure, sure, some silver, some gold, but they wanted women, wanted slaves, wanted profit. They got corpses instead, burned by mutilated corpses with no resale value, economic failure, but they destroyed the monastery, killed everyone, made an example, so they won that way. The nuns didn't win either. They're dead, faces destroyed, bodies burned, but they preserved their virginity, achieved martyrdom, secured salvation in medieval theological terms. So they won that way. Nobody wins, really. Everyone loses. The nuns lose their lives. The Vikings lose their profit. The world loses a monastery and the knowledge it contained. The only winner is the story. It survives, spreads, becomes immortal, more permanent than stone, more powerful than swords. The story of women who chose razors over rape, chose mutilation over submission, chose death over dishonor. 870, Coldingham. Ebba and her 40 nuns. Blood on stone, fire on wood, faith in action, horror made holy. A choice so extreme it echoes through 1,000 years. That's what Vikings did to women, but that's also what women did to themselves. And somehow the second part is worse. Because Vikings you can fight, Vikings you can hate, Vikings you can kill, but a culture that makes mutilation look rational? That's unbeatable. That's the real enemy. And it wore crosses, not horned helmets. The archaeology team working at Coldingham found one more thing, a boundary marker. stone carved with crosses and Norse-style decorative patterns, hybrid design, Viking and Christian imagery mixed, dating to the 9th or 10th century. Right after the raids, after the burnings, after the deaths, someone carved this stone, placed it on the boundary, marking territory, claiming land, mixing cultures. Vikings didn't just destroy and leave, they stayed, settled, married local women, built farms, raised children. The raiders became residents. The enemies became neighbors. The culture that created Ebba's choice changed, softened, Christianized. By the mid-900s, Vikings in England are converting, taking Christian wives, attending churches. The violence doesn't stop completely, but it transforms, becomes political instead of existential, territorial instead of cultural. By 1000, Viking York is a Christian city. Viking Dublin has churches, the boundary blurs, the choice Ebba faced disappears, not because women became safer, but because Vikings became Christians. The threat internalized instead of external. That boundary marker sits in a museum now, stone and meaning separated from place, but it tells the end of the story. The horror was temporary. The choice was specific to a moment. 870, Danes conquering Northumbria. Pagan raiders facing Christian virgins. 50 years later, that conflict is over. Different problems arise, different choices emerge. Ebba's mutilation becomes history, becomes legend, becomes lesson, but it stops being necessary. That's something, not much. The women still died, the nuns still suffered, the system still broke them, but it ended. The world moved on, as it does, as it has to, because otherwise the horror is unbearable. So we tell stories, write chronicles, build museums, place distance between then and now, between their choices and ours, between their razors and our comfort. And we call it history, call it legend, call it hagiography, call it anything except what it is. People trapped by circumstances beyond control, making impossible choices with permanent consequences. 870, Coldingham, Ebba the Younger, 40 nuns, razors, blood, fire, faith, the end.